December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent beneath a thick blanket of snow, its pines heavy, its valleys deep, its quiet deceptive. For the men of the US 106th Infantry Division, this quiet sector along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge was meant to be a reprieve, a chance to acclimate before the final push into Germany. Few could have known that within days, this so-called quiet front would become the epicenter of Hitler's last desperate gamble, and that entire companies of American soldiers would vanish without a trace. The 106th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Golden Lions, was a young formation, many of its men barely out of training, having arrived in Europe only weeks earlier. Commanded by Major General Alan W. Jones, the division replaced veteran units along a 21-mile stretch of thinly held front. It was an exposed position, vulnerable to surprise, but no one in the Allied command believed the Germans had the strength left for another major offensive. Snow fell endlessly, muffling the sounds of movement, and the men dug in, cold and cautious, believing they faced little more than sporadic patrols. On the morning of December 15th, a lieutenant in the 423rd Infantry noted in his diary, "The forest is too still. Even the birds are gone. Feels like something's waiting." His unease was prophetic. In the dark hours before dawn on December 16th, the stillness was shattered by the thunder of artillery. Thousands of German guns unleashing one of the most intense barrages of the war. Trees splintered, trenches collapsed, and men scrambled for cover as the ground convulsed beneath them. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Cut telephone lines and jammed radios plunged the 106th into confusion. Reports filtered in. Enemy armor spotted to the south, infantry columns advancing through the woods, bridges blown or seized. Units of the German 5th Panzer Army and the elite 18th Volksgrenadier Division surged forward, surrounding the 422nd and 423rd Regiments. Within hours, their supply routes were severed, their maps rendered useless by shifting battle lines. Orders from higher command failed to reach them. "No communication with Jones," one officer wrote. "No contact with 424th. We're alone." As the attack deepened, fog rolled across the ridges, obscuring everything beyond a few yards. American squads found themselves cut off, firing at silhouettes that appeared and vanished in the mist. Snow mixed with smoke and blood. Rations dwindled. The cold gnawed at exposed skin, freezing weapons in men's hands. It wasn't a battle anymore, one survivor later recalled. It was survival, minute to minute. Meanwhile, headquarters miles away struggled to understand what was happening. Allied intelligence had detected signs of a German buildup, but dismissed them as defensive posturing. The reports coming in now, fragmented, contradictory, painted a picture of disaster. Some messages claimed the 106th was holding firm. Others said entire regiments had disappeared. By December 18th, General Jones himself was nearly cut off, his division effectively isolated in the snowy wilderness of the Ardennes. In a single day, positions that had taken weeks to fortify were overrun. Columns of German tanks rolled through American lines marked only by burning vehicles and scattered corpses. Attempts to organize a breakout failed as blizzards grounded Allied air support. The men of the 106th fought with dwindling ammunition, often scavenging from the dead. When night fell, the forest came alive with the echo of footsteps, shouted orders, some German, some English, and the distant rumble of engines moving deeper west. By December 19th, the fate of the 422nd and 423rd Regiments was uncertain. Last known transmissions spoke of encirclement near Bleialf and Schönberg. Then silence. For the next 48 hours, no one at Etoile Corps headquarters could confirm their status. Patrols sent to locate them never returned. Maps showed the regiments still in place, but no radio contact could be established. To the outside world, they had simply vanished. In the confusion of the Ardennes, disappearance was not uncommon. Soldiers captured, lost, or buried beneath snow. But what made the case of the 106th so haunting was the scale. More than 6,000 men seemed to have melted away into the forest, leaving behind only frozen foxholes and abandoned gear. For families back home, letters stopped abruptly. No word of capture, no official report of death, just absence. As German momentum carried the front line westward, the question spread through Allied ranks. What happened to the 106th? Some believed they had been wiped out entirely. Others whispered of mass surrender, even betrayal. General Eisenhower demanded answers, but few could give them. The fog of war had swallowed the Golden Lions whole. The Battle of the Bulge was still in its opening days, and the Allied counterattack was weeks away. Yet already, a mystery was forming within the chaos, one that would linger long after the guns fell silent. Somewhere in the frozen woods of the Ardennes, hundreds of American soldiers had vanished from the record. Their fate remained unknown, their story unwritten, and as the snow continued to fall, the forest kept its secrets. By December 16, 1944, the world's largest land battle fought by the US Army had begun. The Germans called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last attempt to split the Allied front and capture Antwerp. In the dense, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, the 106th Infantry Division's fate was being sealed. The 422nd and 423rd Regiments, positioned along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, were surrounded by forces they could scarcely imagine. The German 5th Panzer Army, led by General Hasso von Manteuffel, and elite units from the 18th Volksgrenadier Division. From the outset, confusion reigned. Radio contact with higher command was unreliable, and field telephones had been destroyed by artillery fire. The snow muffled movement and distorted sound, making it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Lieutenant Colonel George L. Deschanel Jr., commanding the 422nd, realized too late that his regiment had been enveloped from both flanks. German armored spearheads had driven past their positions, while infantry infiltrated through the woods. By nightfall, they were cut off from resupply and reinforcement. Deschanel's officers debated their options. Some urged an immediate breakout west towards St. Vith, but icy roads, blown bridges, and relentless enemy shelling made retreat suicidal. Others argued to hold fast and wait for relief, but relief was not coming. The 106th Reserve Regiment, the 424th, was already fighting for its own survival. General Jones, at divisional headquarters in St. Vith, could barely reach his encircled units. His last transmission to the trapped regiments was terse: hold at all costs. Inside the pocket, conditions worsened by the hour. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Men huddled in snow-covered foxholes, surviving on frozen rations and melted snow. Ammunition ran low. Mortar rounds were rationed, and some riflemen had only a handful of bullets left. Private letters recovered later described the exhaustion and disbelief of men who had trained for months, but were now facing annihilation in a place few had even heard of. One soldier scrawled on a scrap of paper, "We're not fighting men anymore, just shadows trying to stay warm." German loudspeakers blared through the fog, urging surrender. "Americana! You are surrounded. Lay down your arms!" Some units held firm, others hesitated. On December 18th, a small group from the 423rd attempted to break through toward Schönberg, only to encounter German armor from the 14th Cavalry Regiment. Their assault was crushed. Survivors staggered back into the forest, wounded and frostbitten. Meanwhile, at 8th Corps headquarters, General Troy Middleton's staff struggled to piece together the situation. Messages from forward units were garbled or outdated by the time they arrived. The 106th's position on the maps looked intact, until reconnaissance reports revealed vast enemy columns behind their lines. What Middleton didn't know was that nearly 8,000 men were now completely surrounded east of St. Vith, trapped in a tightening noose. At dawn on December 19th, after 3 days of continuous fighting, Deschanel and Colonel Charles Cavender of the 423rd convened to assess their options. Ammunition was nearly gone. Artillery support was silent. With German armor closing in from all sides, they faced an impossible choice: fight to the death or surrender to prevent further slaughter. Against the backdrop of exploding shells and burning pines, both officers decided to capitulate. That afternoon, under a white flag made from a bedsheet, the regimental staff marched toward the German lines. When the firing stopped, silence fell again over the Schnee-Eifel. What followed was confusion. Columns of weary, frostbitten Americans were herded through the snow, some toward Prüm, others toward Gerolstein. But as the prisoners disappeared into the forested roads, Allied observers lost track of them. Not all reached the prison camps. By the time the surrender was confirmed, Corps could account for neither the 422nd nor the 423rd. Reports varied wildly. Some claimed 6,000 men had been captured. Others said fewer than 3,000 survived. The rest were simply missing. Allied aerial reconnaissance failed to locate the convoys. For the next week, The official situation reports listed both regiments as unconfirmed, presumed lost. Among the soldiers' families back home, telegrams soon followed. "Your son is missing in action." For some, the words would remain unchanged for years. But within the Allied command, questions grew. Why had the 106th been deployed to such a vulnerable sector? Why were intelligence warnings of German buildup ignored? And most unsettling of all, what had become of the thousands of men who never reappeared in POW rolls or casualty lists? The disappearance of the 422nd and 423rd was not a mere battlefield tragedy. It was a vanishing act on a scale that baffled even seasoned commanders. In the chaos of Hitler's final offensive, the fog of war had hidden more than troop movements. It had swallowed whole regiments. As winter deepened and the Allies prepared their counterattack, rumors began to circulate. Some said the missing were executed by SS units. Others claimed they were marched east to secret camps that no longer existed by the war's end. The truth was buried somewhere beneath the snow, waiting to be uncovered. The 106th Division had entered the Ardennes with 15,000 men. By the end of December, fewer than 8,000 remained. For the US Army, it was one of the greatest single losses in its history. And yet, the details of what truly happened in those fog-shrouded woods were already slipping into silence. The vanished soldiers had become ghosts of the Ardennes, lost to time, lost to war. The first reports of missing patrols reached American lines on December 20th, 1944. Snow continued to fall relentlessly across the Ardennes, transforming the battlefield into a white, frozen labyrinth. The front was fragmented, disjointed and chaotic, as Allied forces fought desperately to stem the German advance. Somewhere in that chaos, thousands of soldiers from the 106th Infantry Division had simply vanished. But for those left behind, the mystery was just beginning. Scattered groups of survivors emerged from the forest in ones and twos, frostbitten, starving, their uniforms torn and bloodied. They spoke of relentless shelling, failed breakouts, and sudden disappearances in the fog. Some recounted seeing entire companies swallowed by the woods, never to return. "One minute they were behind us," recalled Private Edward Lasco of the 423rd. The next, gone. Not killed, just gone. The Battle of the Bulge had transformed the Ardennes into a place of disorientation and terror. Visibility was often less than 50 feet, and enemy movements were nearly impossible to track. American patrols sent to locate the missing encountered eerie scenes. Foxholes filled with snow, weapons stacked neatly as if abandoned in haste, and blood trails that vanished beneath drifts. "It felt like the forest itself had eaten them," one sergeant later said. By Christmas Eve, the town of St. Vith had become a shattered ruin, the epicenter of the desperate Allied defense. The 7th Armored Division, under General Robert Hasbrouck, and remnants of the 106th fought side by side, trying to delay the German advance. But with communications still in disarray, even experienced units struggled to understand the scope of what had been lost. A report from the 8th Corps headquarters described severe fragmentation of forces and uncertain status of the Schnee-Eifel regiments, military language for the unthinkable. No one knew where thousands of men were. In the nearby Belgian villages of Meierode and Schönberg, civilians began whispering stories of American prisoners forced down the icy roads by German guards. Some described men so weak they could barely stand. Others heard gunfire echoing through the woods long after the columns had passed. But these accounts were fragmentary, second-hand and impossible to verify amid the frontline chaos. Allied intelligence, preoccupied with stemming the broader offensive, logged the testimonies but took no immediate action. In early January 1945, as the tide of the battle began to shift, the Allies slowly pushed back into the territory once held by the enemy. Patrols from the 82nd Airborne Division and the 30th Infantry Division moved cautiously through the wreckage of what had been the 106th sector. What they found was haunting. Snow-covered helmets, broken rifles, and ration tins lay scattered across the ground. In the ruins near Blyalf, they discovered frozen bodies, some lying in neat rows, others half buried beneath collapsed trenches. Yet even after days of searching, the numbers didn't add up. The dead they found were far fewer than those listed as missing. The weather compounded the horror. Temperatures plunged below 20 Celsius. Frozen corpses were sometimes mistaken for snowbanks. Weapons fused to the ground by ice. The terrain itself became a crypt. In some locations, retreating Germans had stripped bodies of identification to use dog tags as deception tools, a tactic later confirmed by military investigators. This practice only deepened the confusion for the US Graves Registration Service, which struggled to match names to remains. Amid the devastation, one curious discovery caught the attention of military intelligence: an abandoned German truck near Prüm, filled with captured American documents and personal effects, wallets, family photos, and unit insignia from the 106th Division. Many of the names on those items would never reappear in any POW or casualty registry. It was as if they had been processed and then erased, one investigator noted in his after-action report. Survivors captured by German forces later told stories that seemed to confirm the worst fears. They described being separated from other prisoners, men taken away in small groups, marched down forest roads under guard, and never seen again. They said they were being moved east, one POW testified. But east to where? We never found out. Some speculated that these men were victims of summary executions by SS troops operating behind the lines. Others believed they were redirected to forced labor camps deep inside Germany, where wartime chaos and Allied bombings obliterated all trace of them. The US Army's official stance after the battle was cautious. It acknowledged the loss of the 422nd and 423rd Regiments as a catastrophic encirclement, but offered no definitive explanation for the missing. The war was still raging, and command priorities lay elsewhere, in pushing the Germans back across the Rhine. But for those who had seen the empty trenches and silent forests of the Schnee-Eifel, the question remained: how could thousands of men vanish without a single verified trail? As the Allies advanced eastward in the following weeks, they liberated German POW camps and began identifying captured Americans. Yet, as the lists were compiled, the numbers still didn't align. Even after accounting for known prisoners and confirmed dead, hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000, of the 106th's men remained unaccounted for. Their fate had become a quiet but persistent riddle in the war's aftermath. The forest, once filled with the sound of artillery, was now eerily still. Snow continued to fall over the ridges and ravines, covering the scars of battle. Beneath that silence, somewhere in the frozen earth, lay the untold story of the vanished soldiers. Their absence was more than a tragedy. It was a question that refused to fade. And as investigators returned to the Ardennes in the months that followed, they would uncover disturbing clues suggesting that the disappearances were not merely the work of chance, but perhaps something far more deliberate. By early January 1945, the thunder of the German offensive had begun to fade. The Allies were regaining ground across the Ardennes, pushing eastward through the snow-covered ruins of villages like St. Vith, Schönberg, and Blyalf. The tide had turned. But amid the victory, the American command faced a grim realization. Hundreds of soldiers from the 106th Infantry Division were still missing. They were not listed among the dead, nor were they counted among the liberated prisoners. It was as if they had simply vanished into the forest itself. For the families back home, telegrams arrived in cold, bureaucratic language. The War Department regrets to inform you that your son is missing in action. No further details. No reassurance, just silence. Yet within the US Army's own files, confusion reigned. Reports from different corps contradicted one another. Some claimed large numbers of 106th men had been captured near Blyalf. Others said they were wiped out during the retreat. The numbers didn't add up. Intelligence officers, reviewing the after-action reports, noted discrepancies in casualty counts and possible administrative misclassification. Behind those dry terms lay a deeper unease. What had actually happened to the missing? The recovery efforts began as the snow slowly melted. Teams from the US Graves Registration Service were dispatched to the former battlefields, tasked with identifying the dead. What they found only deepened the mystery. Around Schönberg, small burial pits were discovered. Not formal graves, but shallow depressions hastily covered with earth and pine branches. Inside were groups of American soldiers, some still wearing their dog tags, others stripped of identification. Many appeared to have been executed at close range. One Graves registration report, dated March 1945, described a chilling scene near the village of Andler. 16 bodies found in single pit. No battle damage apparent. Evidence of gunshot wounds to the back of the head. Likely prisoners of war. The report was classified and filed quietly away. there would be no public mention of such discoveries for decades. Even as these grim findings accumulated, other elements of the story refused to align. The official POW rosters compiled by the International Red Cross did not include hundreds of names known to belong to the 422nd and 423rd Regiments. German documentation of captured American soldiers was incomplete. Many lists had been destroyed during retreat or Allied bombing raids, but intelligence officers noticed patterns. Men who had been confirmed as captured were missing from subsequent reports, their paper trail abruptly ending. "It was as though they disappeared in transit," one officer wrote. "We could trace them up to a point, then nothing." The US Army launched an internal inquiry. Field investigators interviewed surviving officers, analyzed radio logs, and pored over German documents seized from abandoned command posts. One such document, a partially burned report from the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, mentioned processing of captured personnel near Prüm. No further details. What processing meant in that context remained unclear. Complicating matters was the brutal reality of the winter retreat. Many POW columns were forced to march for days through deep snow with little food or shelter. Dozens collapsed from exhaustion and exposure. Witnesses described guards shooting prisoners who could no longer keep pace. These atrocities were later documented at Malmedy and other locations, but the fates of the 106th's missing men were harder to pinpoint. Some survivors insisted they had seen groups of captured comrades diverted away from the main columns, escorted by SS troops. "They said they were taking them to a separate camp," one remembered. "But when we reached the next holding area, they were gone." By late February, as Allied forces advanced toward the Rhine, General Eisenhower's staff ordered a comprehensive review of the 106th Division's losses. The findings were unsettling. Over 6,600 men confirmed as prisoners, nearly 500 confirmed dead, and more than 700 unaccounted for. Despite the chaos of battle, such a number was inexplicable. Where were these men? Among the documents unearthed after the war were captured German communications referencing special detachments handling Allied prisoners east of the Ardennes. Some historians later speculated these referred to SS units tasked with intelligence screening, separating officers, linguists, or technical specialists from regular troops, but no records survived to confirm who was taken or why. In the aftermath, questions were raised within the Army's own ranks. Was this disappearance the result of clerical chaos, battlefield confusion, or something darker? The answer was never clear. When the war ended, the missing were quietly listed as presumed dead. Their files were closed. Families received letters expressing deepest sympathy, but little explanation. Yet the story did not end there. Years later, veterans returning to the Ardennes would speak of haunting sights. Rusted helmets half buried in the soil, fragments of uniforms caught in tree roots, the occasional discovery of human remains unearthed by storms. Each find reopened old wounds and reignited questions about what really happened during those frozen weeks of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was hailed as an Allied victory, but for the 106th Division, victory came too late. Their ordeal had been buried under layers of official silence, overshadowed by the larger triumph of the Western Front. Still, the mystery endured. In the unmarked graves, in the missing names, and in the enduring absence that no report could explain. As the war moved on to the Rhine and beyond, the files of the vanished soldiers were quietly archived. But within the still forests of the Ardennes, beneath the snow and soil, the echoes of that disappearance remained, waiting for someone to ask again, what really happened on the Schnee Eifel? And though the guns had fallen silent, the forest had not yet spoken its last word. In the spring of 1945, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine and the war in Europe neared its end, a quieter battle began. A search not for victory, but for answers. The US Graves Registration Service, along with intelligence officers from SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, returned to the frozen woods of the Ardennes to locate and identify the missing men of the 106th Infantry Division. The snow had begun to thaw, revealing the scars of battle, burned-out tanks, shattered helmets, and the remains of foxholes that once sheltered hundreds of young soldiers. What they found beneath the melting snow would reignite one of the war's most troubling mysteries. At first, the teams recovered only fragments, scattered bones, pieces of identification, rusted weapons. Near Schönberg, a patrol uncovered a cluster of shallow graves, hastily dug, unmarked. Within them lay American soldiers, many still wearing remnants of their winter uniforms. Some had bullet wounds to the back of the head, others appeared to have died of exposure. The evidence was contradictory and unsettling. Were they executed prisoners, or men who simply froze while trying to escape encirclement? Reports filtered upward to Army Command, but few were released to the public. An internal memo dated April 1945 noted, "Evidence suggests irregular handling of US prisoners by enemy units in Ardennes sector. Further investigation recommended." The memo was quietly filed away as the war's focus shifted to liberation and occupation. Survivors of the 106th, returning from POW camps in Germany, began to tell their stories. They spoke of chaotic marches eastward through snow and hunger. Some remembered being separated from fellow prisoners without explanation. "They took about 100 men from our column," recalled Sergeant Richard Broyles. "Said they needed them for transport duties. We never saw them again." Another survivor mentioned trains leaving from Gerolstein, packed with Americans but bound for unknown destinations. When questioned by US intelligence after the war, few German officers could account for these movements. Records lost, they claimed, bombed by the Allies. By late 1945, the US War Department had opened a limited investigation into the missing men. Field teams interviewed villagers across eastern Belgium and western Germany. In Blyalf, one farmer recalled seeing groups of American prisoners march through town in December 1944. "They looked half dead," he told investigators. "Then one morning, the guards were gone, and so were the prisoners." Other locals pointed to nearby forests, where they claimed to have seen fresh mounds of earth after the Germans withdrew. Excavations found remains, but never enough to explain the scale of the disappearance. Even among US records, inconsistencies persisted. The number of recovered bodies never matched the total of those declared missing. At one point, the discrepancy exceeded 600 men. The official explanation cited recording errors and battlefield conditions. But privately, investigators were less certain. In one declassified letter from a chef intelligence officer, a handwritten note in the margin reads, "Certain field reports suggest executions by SS units. No confirmation." In the years that followed, the graves registration teams continued their work, long after the rest of Europe began rebuilding. By 1948, the majority of identified remains had been reinterred at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, yet hundreds of graves remained empty. On paper, the case was closed, presumed dead, unlocated. But in truth, many of the missing still had no known resting place. Families of the 106th soldiers refused to let the matter fade. They wrote to the War Department, senators, even President Truman, demanding answers. Some received polite replies, others none at all. "How can a whole regiment disappear?" one mother asked in a letter preserved in the National Archives. "My son was not a ghost." For these families, the war had not ended. It had simply gone silent. By the 1950s, amateur historians and veterans groups began their own investigations. They retraced the routes of the captured regiments, interviewed local witnesses, and compared diaries and German field orders. Some found evidence suggesting that captured Americans had been used in forced labor near railway depots destroyed by Allied bombings. Deaths later lost amid the chaos of collapsing German infrastructure. Others believed the truth was more sinister, that SS units, operating independently during the retreat, executed prisoners to avoid slowing their withdrawal. In one particularly striking account, a Belgian farmer unearthed human remains in the late 1950s near a wooded ravine east of Schönberg. Among the bones were US dog tags and a fragment of a uniform bearing the insignia of the 106th Division. Military records confirmed that the names on those tags belonged to men never listed among the dead or returned POWs. The discovery reignited speculation that some of the vanished soldiers had been executed and buried in secret. Despite such finds, no official inquiry was reopened. The Cold War had begun, and attention had shifted elsewhere. The files of the 106th were archived, labeled as resolved, presumed casualties. But for historians and relatives, the mystery persisted. Every discovery, a single tag, a rusted weapon, a name inscribed on a recovered Bible, was another whisper from the snow, another unanswered question. As time passed, the Battle of the Bulge became a story of heroism and endurance, A tale of how the Allies turned back Germany's final assault. But beneath that narrative ran a quieter truth. A shadowed chapter filled with uncertainty. The fate of hundreds of young men from the 106th Infantry Division was never fully explained. And though the world moved forward, the Ardennes never forgot. Even now, decades later, the forests still give up their secrets. A button, a bone, a silence that lingers. The investigation into the vanished soldiers was far from over. The final chapter of their story, the search for truth, was only beginning. Decades passed. The battlefields of the Ardennes grew quiet again, reclaimed by moss and pine. But for families, veterans, and historians, the silence surrounding the vanished soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division never felt complete. The war had ended, but the questions endured, hidden in classified files, buried under bureaucratic indifference, and scattered across the snowy ridges where so many had disappeared. In the years following the war, the US Army officially recorded over 700 men from the 106th as missing, presumed dead. Yet as post-war documentation trickled in from Europe, inconsistencies emerged. Red Cross archives from Switzerland, German POW records, and testimonies from liberated prisoners often contradicted one another. Some names appeared twice, once as captured and again as deceased. Others vanished entirely from every known ledger. To historians, this was more than a clerical issue. It was a historical gap that refused to close. By the 1960s, the first organized expeditions to the Ardennes began, not military ones, but private searches led by surviving veterans and families of the lost. They returned to the dense forests near Blyalf, Andler, and Schönberg, armed with old maps and memories. What they found was both haunting and strangely intimate. Rusted helmets bearing bullet holes, personal effects stamped with initials, and occasionally shallow graves unearthed by erosion or logging. Each discovery was a fragment of an unfinished story. In 1972, a Belgian forestry worker stumbled upon a set of remains partially exposed by a landslide near the Schnee Eifel Ridge. Among the bones was a dog tag belonging to Private Donald M. Kruger, Company G, 423rd Infantry Regiment, a name long listed as missing in action. Forensic analysis confirmed the identity, but the cause of death was inconclusive. His family received word nearly 30 years after his disappearance. The letter from the Army's Casualty Division contained no answers, only a closure tinged with uncertainty. In later decades, researchers uncovered further clues. Declassified US Army intelligence files from 1945-46 referenced unverified accounts of American prisoners executed by elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division during the German withdrawal. The documents stopped short of naming specific incidents, citing lack of corroborating evidence. Yet within these same archives were aerial reconnaissance photos showing disturbed ground near known POW transit routes. Investigators had noted the sites, but never returned after the war's end. The reports gathered dust, their findings unconfirmed, their implications unsettling. By the 1980s, modern historians began to revisit the 106th's ordeal, armed with new access to wartime German records. Among the files was a fragmentary report from a captured SS officer describing emergency measures taken during prisoner transfers in late December 1944. Though vague, it reignited debate among researchers. Had some of the vanished soldiers been executed during the chaos of retreat, or were they victims of starvation, exposure, and disorganization? Casualties of a system collapsing under its own destruction. Television documentaries and military archives renewed public interest in the story during the 1990s. Veterans of the 106th who had survived captivity gathered for reunions, sharing recollections once buried by time. Many recalled seeing fellow prisoners separated for interrogation, never to return. One veteran, Corporal William Delaney, told an interviewer, "It wasn't the battle that haunted us. It was the ones who never came home, the ones we couldn't find." As the 21st century arrived, technology began to succeed where wartime record-keeping had failed. Teams of researchers, using ground-penetrating radar and metal detection, began mapping the old front lines of the Schnee Eifel. Their discoveries added both clarity and sorrow. Between 2004 and 2012, at least a dozen individual remains of 106th Division soldiers were recovered in the Ardennes region. Each identification closed one file but left hundreds untouched. Each rediscovery whispered the same truth, that the forest still held its dead close. Today, the mystery endures not as a conspiracy, but as a reminder of chaos, of loss, and of the human cost buried within military statistics. The vanished soldiers of the Battle of the Bulge represent the countless untold stories of those consumed by war's confusion. Their disappearance was not one of ghosts or legend, but of exhaustion, miscommunication, and the brutal logistics of an army collapsing in retreat. Yet even as historians piece together the puzzle, a sense of unease remains. How many were executed? How many froze before surrender could save them? And how many still lie beneath the moss and pine, their names fading from memory as the decades pass? Each winter, the Ardennes grows quiet again, its snow falling on ground that once echoed with artillery, and the shouts of men fighting and dying far from home. Beneath that snow, perhaps, still rest the final pieces of the story. Dog tags rusted beyond recognition, a rifle buried beneath tree roots, the faint trace of footprints that led nowhere. The war ended in victory, but for the 106th Infantry Division, closure never came. Their disappearance remains one of World War II's most haunting enigmas, a silence preserved not by secrecy, but by time itself. And in that silence, the Ardennes still remembers.